Todd and Dan. Yeah, we have a question from one of the attendees who's working on a civil structure. What he'd like to do using his SM130 sampling at 1 kilohertz is look at a subset of his sensors and see one value, save one value to a file every 5 minutes. So he was looking at actually averaging all those points over a 5-minute period, so on the order of 100,000 kind of averages. Do you have a recommendation for how he might achieve that and not run into these issues you were mentioning, Dan?
Which issues?
In bogging down the system computationally.
Memory allocation. I think there's a maximum number of averages on the SM130. In the case of the SM130, peak averaging is actually done, FBG averaging is actually done inside the interrogator itself, which I believe has a maximum number of averages of 10,000. So if you're acquiring, at 1 kilohertz, then that's going to give you a 10-second roving window of the average.
We noticed on the FBG averaging, no, I'm sorry, it was in the sensor averaging window. That was in the sensor averaging window in the MI screen would allow 9 digits in the averaging. So would that be another way to approach it? Is do it in Nlight? Okay.
Yep.
We're coming right up on the answer to that.
Yep. And it sounds like the question is two-part as well. Part of it has to do with averaging, and part of it has to do with scheduling of the data saving. So hopefully we'll hit both of those. So in Nlight, yes, you can average on a per FBG basis. So this is for both the SM125 and the SM130 after any spectral averaging that would be done from the acquisition tab. So that if you're averaging the value of that FBG, then any expressions that reference that FBG value will be acting upon that averaged value. So this is something that is commonly used for temperature sensors or temperature compensation sensors, where you don't expect to have appreciable changes or very fast dynamic changes, and averaging directly improves the repeatability of the compensated sensor by eliminating any sort of data acquisition noise on that particular sensor. So in our case, where we reference both a 4200 and the 3100 and the 3200, both reference the same 4100 sensor, that could be averaged at that FBG, for example, and then the strain sensors themselves could be independently averaged to give the 3100 a particular repeatability and time response, and the 4100 a different repeatability and time response. If one was being used to monitor dynamic changes, and the other was being used to monitor very small static changes, then you can independently set those sensor averages while retaining the same averaging on the temperature compensation sensor, which could be done at the FBG level.
Yeah, it's averaging. There's quite a bit to averaging in Nlight because you have to realize the implications of the method that you choose, and you have to realize the implications based upon the instrument that you have. So on an SM125, as Todd mentioned, you can average the spectral response, which will improve, what you can think of, it's improving the source of the data that's being used to do a software peak detection. However, when you average the full spectrum, you are averaging every peak within your system on that channel, or within actually on all channels with the spectral averaging. With the FBG averaging, you're able to target particular FBGs that you want or know have a slow time response, and you want to average in a different way from the rest of the system. So averaging the full spectrum averages everything. The FBG allows you to target it at a very individual level on a particular peak. Averaging at the sensor level aggregates the averaging across the values of all the FBGs within that particular sensor. So as a good example, a temperature compensated strain measurement, as Todd said, you typically would like to average the FBG value for the temperature, the FBG responsible for providing the temperature, at a high rate, say 1,000, because you know it's going to be changing slowly over time. and then not average your FBG that's reporting your strain because you want to see dynamic quantities of that. And you also have to take into account that any noise in the detected FBG for the temperature will feed into your strain directly. So by affecting a large amount of averaging on your temperature, because you know it's slowly changing, you can improve the noise on your resulting strain measurements that you're making. One other thing I'd like to point out is, again, knowing your interrogator. When you do when you're using an SM125, averaging on the FBGs is done in software, and the value can be arbitrarily large. Clearly, you have memory limitations, of course. However, on an SM130, averaging is performed in hardware on the interrogator. There's a limitation that the UI does not enforce that a few people have run into, and we are working to correct that. On the SM130, you are limited to 10,000 averages on an FBG divided by the multiplexer. So if you have a 2-channel multiplexer, or a 2x8 or 4x8, you are limited to 5,000. If you're using a 4-way MUX, so you have a 16-channel system, you're limited to 2,500 averages. If you exceed those numbers, it uses the default value of 1, so you will essentially see no averaging. Again, we're working on that bug to make sure that the UI enforces that and tells you that you've exceeded the value. If you need an exceptionally large number of averages, as Tom asked, on an SM130 where you are limited by this 10,000 divided by the MUX state, you could then choose to do that on the sensor itself, which again is a software averaging, similar to FBGs on an SM125. You can make it arbitrarily large and target a particular sensor, as long as it's okay that you're averaging both the all the FBG components that make up that sensor.
And there's a question that just came in that I think actually relates to part of the solution to the earlier question Tom relayed to us, and that was in part if we're going to be taking data for quite a long time, we're acquiring at a very high rate of speed, and we only want to save a value every so often. How can we average over that entire period? I think it's worth considering diminishing rates of return on averaging. Are you getting significantly more meaningful data by taking 1,000 averages, 10,000, or 100,000 averages? Clearly, at some point, all of that averaging has an effect on the available memory of your system. And so what might make sense is to sort of meet in the middle by reducing the rate at which data is being transferred and doing a large number of averages such that you realize the time period that you want for data saving while getting sort of an optimum effect of averaging while not using excessive amounts of memory, again, where there may be diminishing returns. The new question is, can I lower my SM130 sample rate down from 1 kilohertz? And the answer to that is yes. If we go back to the acquisitions tab, you'll notice here on the upper right of all of our views, we see the acquisition rate here at 1 kilohertz and the available buffer percentage. So here 100% means that we have 100% of our buffer available and that none of it has been used up by our Enlight client falling behind our host instrument. On the bottom left here, you see a data interleave control. What this allows you to do is directly between the Enlight interface and the instrumentation interfaces to reduce the rate at which data is served from the instrument. So while this is not literally changing the speed of your 1 kilohertz instrument, what it is doing is allowing the instrument to continue running at 1 kilohertz where all of the receiver electronics have been tuned, where all the calibration has been optimized, but then to reduce the data rate to whatever your needs are, which may be less than 1 kilohertz. So, for example, if I change the data interleave from 1 to 10, you'll immediately see that this drops from 1 kilohertz to 100 hertz, and that we see a corresponding reduction in the rate at which data is transferred.
This is a particularly useful thing to use if you have a remote system over, say, a cellular link. By reducing the data, by increasing the data interleave, i.e. sending the data less often, you require far less network bandwidth, a factor of 10 less, to achieve the same results. The beauty of the SM130, again, as I mentioned a moment ago, FBG averaging is performed in hardware, so you can still set an averaging of 10,000, say on a 4-channel system, and set the data interleave to be 10 or 100 or even 1,000. So now you're receiving data once a second, but you're still gaining the advantage of averaging it using 10,000 data points. So over an extremely slow cellular network, you're able to still receive data, stream data, make sure you don't miss any data, but again, have all the benefits of averaging over 10 seconds without the need for the bandwidth to transmit all that data to your system.
Okay, so go from interleave of 10 back to an interleave of 1. You see we resume at the full 1 kilohertz. Okay. Let's see where we are on our sensors. Okay, so we've added a sensor later, and we've done independent sensor zeroing, even with the common temperature compensation we shared. Talked a little bit about when to average FBGs, when to average sensors, and indeed when to average spectrum. And then also, there's a new feature that is on a current beta build that will be released soon that allows you to view the current and historical values of these FBG reference values for each. So as we independently zero the sensors, and each sensor independently records its own version of its FBG reference values, we're able to go back and view what those values were and when they were changed. And Dan can walk us through how to view that.
Edit a sensor.
Okay. Edit one?
Yeah, it's double click.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a very common request that we've had, that once you've zeroed these sensors, it's a little bit difficult to find what the reference values for the FBGs and any external sensors that it may reference are for recording purposes, historical, whatever, or if you want to change it to a particular value that you know is the correct value, the system before would only let you zero it, i.e. take a snapshot of the current value. So if you select the reference tab, so now what we have is an interface here to show you the FBGs that your sensor uses. Here it's FBG C4 and C5, and _0 is the reference value, and we can see what the value is. And if you select one of them, you could come down and you could modify that value to anything that you know to be the correct value for whatever reason that might be. Go ahead and change the last 5 to a 6, or just make a change. And hit update. And now, as you see where Todd has updated the value on the right side, you can see the date that it was changed and the value that it used to have. So now, if your system becomes modified and you want to see what happened, you can come back into the system, look here, and see on what date it changed, as well as what the previous value was, if for some reason you need to put that back. And again, it tracks both FBGs as well as external sensors used to calculate the physical quantity.
So if I remember the outline accurately, I think that may cover, unless we have something else.